March 1969, 11:47 p.m., Harlem. Frank Lucas sat alone in his apartment with $100,000 in cash spread across his kitchen table. Bills in neat stacks, 20s, 50s, hundreds, the smell of ink and paper and possibility. He counted it 3 times, same number every time, $100, $0, made in one night from blue magic sales that had exploded faster than even Frank had anticipated. Frank was 38 years old. He'd arrived in Harlem 23 years earlier with $40 in his pocket and hunger in his gut. And now, sitting at this table looking at more money than he'd ever seen in one place, he was facing the most important decision of his life, not whether to continue, but how, because $100,000 was a threshold, an amount that changed things, an amount that demanded a choice. About who you were going to become, Frank didn't sleep that night, just sat at the table, smoking cigarettes, drinking coffee, staring at the money, thinking about what it meant, what it could mean, what it should mean. By the time the sun came up, Frank had written 3 options on a piece of paper, 3 paths forward, 3 different versions of who Frank Lucas could be. Only one of them would become real. And that choice, made in a kitchen in Harlem on a March morning in 1969, would determine everything that came after. To understand why this moment mattered, you need to understand where Frank had come from. Not just geographically, psychologically. 1930, LaGrange, North Carolina. Frank was born into poverty so deep it felt genetic. His mother cleaned houses for $3 a week. His father picked tobacco until his hands bled. 6 children in a 2-room shack where hunger was as reliable as sunrise. Frank was 12 when he watched the Ku Klux Klan tie his cousin to a tree. Not to kill him, just to remind him he was powerless, that he would always be powerless, that the world was built by people who had power and maintained by keeping people like Frank's family from getting any. That night, young Frank made a promise to himself: never again, never powerless, never small. Never controlled by people who thought they were better because they were born into different circumstances. He left North Carolina at 15 with $40 and that promise. Arrived in Harlem in 1946 and spent the next 20 years learning what power actually looked like. It didn't look like violence. Violence was just a tool. Power was control. Power was systems. Power was understanding how things worked and making them work for you instead of against you. Frank learned this from Bumpy Johnson, spent 15 years watching Bumpy operate, learning discipline, learning patience, learning that real power doesn't announce itself. It just is. When Bumpy died in 1968, Frank inherited territory and opportunity. But more importantly, he inherited a question: what kind of man do you want to be? Most of Bumpy's lieutenants played it safe. Worked with the Italian families who controlled Harlem's drug trade, accepted the markup, accepted their place in a system someone else controlled. Frank did something different. He went to Vietnam, made connections with suppliers in the Golden Triangle, cut out every middleman, brought pure heroin directly into Harlem at a price and quality that made everything else obsolete. Blue magic, that's what he called it, and it worked better than Frank had expected. By March 1969, 3 months after his first shipment, Frank was moving product faster than he could count it, which brought him to this moment, this table, this money, this decision. Frank looked at the paper where he'd written his 3 options. 11:32 a.m., Sunday morning. Harlem was quiet, church bells in the distance. The smell of someone cooking breakfast next door, and Frank Lucas sitting in his kitchen with $100,000 about to choose who he would become. Option 1, legitimate exit. Frank could take this money and go clean, not all at once, that would attract attention, but gradually invest in legitimate businesses, buy a restaurant, some real estate, laundromats, car washes, things that generated legal income and clean dirty money until it looked respectable. He could do this. Other men had made their money in the street and transitioned into legitimate business. It took time, took patience, but it was possible. Frank closed his eyes and imagined this path. 5 years from now, he'd own 3 restaurants in Harlem, maybe a small chain, Lucas's Place, good food, fair prices, employed local people, built something the community could be proud of. 10 years from now, he'd be a legitimate businessman, real estate portfolio, maybe some political connections, the kind of man who showed up at community events and cut ribbons at grand openings. 20 years from now, he'd be old, successful, clean. His children wouldn't have to explain what their father did. His grandchildren wouldn't care. Criminal's last name, this path offered safety, respectability, a chance to be remembered for something other than drugs, but it also required giving up control. because legitimate business meant partners, regulations, systems you had to work within instead of around, rules that applied to you the same way they applied to everyone else. Frank opened his eyes, looked at the money, thought about that path, possible, practical, safe, but not what he wanted, not yet. Option 2, family security. Frank could take this money and secure his family. His mother still lived in North Carolina, still cleaned houses even though Frank sent her money every month. His brothers and sisters were scattered, some struggling, some barely getting by. $100,000 could change all of that, could buy his mother a real house, could set up his siblings with businesses or education, could lift the whole family out of the poverty they'd been born into. Frank imagined this path too. His mother in a house with a porch and a garden, no more cleaning other people's homes, no more $3 weeks, just comfort, security, the respect she'd earned but never received. His brothers running their own businesses, nothing illegal, just honest work that paid enough to live with dignity. His sisters with houses and children who didn't grow up hungry. The Lucas family, pulled out of LaGrange poverty by Frank's success. Everything he'd promised himself at 12 years old, never powerless, never small. This path offered redemption, proof that he'd kept his promise, that he'd built something that mattered beyond just himself, but it also required stopping, because if Frank took this money and gave it to his family, he couldn't also expand, couldn't scale up operations, couldn't build the empire he was starting to see as possible. He'd have to choose family now or power later. Frank looked at the money again, thought about his mother, about his promise. Important, meaningful, right, but not enough, not yet. Option 3, empire. Frank could take this money and reinvest it, scale up operations. Increase shipments from Vietnam, expand distribution beyond Harlem, build not just a business but a system, an empire that would make him untouchable, unignorable, undeniable. $100,000 wasn't the goal, it was seed money, proof of concept, the beginning of something much bigger. This path offered power, real power, the kind that came from controlling systems instead of just participating in them, the kind that meant nobody could make you small ever again. Frank imagined this version. 5 years from now, he'd control drug distribution throughout New York, not just Harlem, all 5 boroughs. The Italian families would be irrelevant. He'd have cut them out completely. 10 years from now, he'd be making millions, not hundreds of thousands, millions, plural, more money than he could spend. More power than anyone could take away. 20 years from now. Frank couldn't quite imagine 20 years from now on this path, because this path was built on risk, on breaking laws, on making enemies, on operating in a world where consequences were always possible. But those were future problems. Right now, in this moment, this path offered something the other 2 didn't: complete control, no partners, no compromises, no rules except the ones Frank made. This was the path that 12-year-old Frank had dreamed about. The path that meant never being powerless, never being controlled, never being small. Frank stood up, walked to the window, looked out at Harlem, the neighborhood that had been his home for 23 years, the place where he'd learned everything Bumpy had taught him. What would Bumpy do? Frank asked himself this question often. Bumpy was gone, but his lessons remained. Bumpy had operated within systems, had made peace with the Italian families, had built power through respect and discipline and patience, had been successful without being reckless, but Bumpy had also died with regrets. Frank knew this, had heard it in Bumpy's voice toward the end, wondered what could have been, what he could have built if he'd been willing to take bigger risks. Frank turned back to the table, to the money, to the 3 options. He picked up the pen, drew a line through option 1. Legitimate business would mean giving up control, and Frank wasn't ready to give up control, not when he'd just proven he could operate outside traditional systems. He looked at option 2, family security. This one was harder, because Frank loved his family. Wanted to provide for them, wanted to prove that he'd kept his promise. But providing for them now meant stopping his own growth, meant choosing their security over his power, and Frank couldn't do that, not yet, because if he stopped now, he'd always wonder what could have been. Would always feel like he'd settled instead of conquered. Frank drew a line through option 2, which left option 3, empire. Frank didn't draw a line through this one, just circled it, once, twice, 3 times. This was it. This was the choice, not the safe choice, not the right choice by most people's standards, but the choice that matched who Frank Lucas actually was. He wasn't a man who wanted safety. He was a man who wanted control, who wanted to prove that the 12-year-old who'd watched his cousin tied to a tree could build something so big that nobody would ever dare to treat him or his family that way again. Frank gathered up the money, didn't put it in a safe, put it in a bag, because this money wasn't for saving. It was for using, for expanding, for building. By that evening, Frank had made calls, arranged for increased shipments from Vietnam, set up new distribution channels, identified new territories to expand into. The $100,000 was already in motion, already becoming something bigger, and Frank Lucas was already becoming the version of himself he'd chosen that morning. Not the legitimate businessman, not the family protector, but the empire builder. The choice felt right. At 38, sitting in that kitchen, looking at those three options, Frank was certain he'd made the right decision. He couldn't have known then what that decision would cost, couldn't have known that building an empire would mean losing everything else, couldn't have known that the power he was chasing would eventually become the cage he couldn't escape. But that morning in March 1969, those future consequences felt distant, theoretical, possible but not inevitable. All Frank knew was this: he'd been given a choice about who to become, and he'd chosen power over safety, empire over family, control over compromise. Years later, sitting in a federal prison cell, Frank would think about that morning, about those three options, about the choice he'd made. By then, option one didn't seem so boring: legitimate business, safety, respectability, his children not having to visit him in prison, his wife not having to testify against him, his empire not collapsed. His freedom not gone. By then, option two didn't seem so limiting: family security, his mother comfortable, his siblings successful, his own children growing up normal, not wealthy, but normal, safe, unjudged. But Frank had chosen option three, and you can't unchoose. You can't go back to a fork in the road and take the other path. You can only live with the path you chose and wonder about the ones you didn't. In his final years, when people asked Frank about his life, about his choices, about his regrets, he'd often come back to that morning. I had $100,000 and three choices, he'd say. I chose wrong, but I didn't know it was wrong then. That's the thing about wrong choices. They feel right when you make them. Someone asked him once, if you could go back, which option would you choose? Frank thought about it for a long time. Finally, I'd like to say option one or two. I'd like to say I'd choose different, but honestly, I'd probably choose the same, because that's who I was, and you can't be someone you're not just because you know better later. That was the truth of it. Frank Lucas chose empire because Frank Lucas was the kind of man who would always choose empire. The 12-year-old who watched his cousin tied to a tree didn't dream of owning a restaurant or securing his family. He dreamed of power, of never being small, of control, and when given the choice, Frank chose what he'd always been going to choose. The tragedy wasn't the choice itself. The tragedy was that the choice worked. Blue magic became massive. Frank's empire grew beyond anything he'd imagined that morning. He made millions, became legendary. Built something that seemed untouchable, which made the fall that much harder. Because if option three had failed immediately, Frank could have pivoted, could have chosen one of the other paths, but it didn't fail. It succeeded, wildly, which locked Frank into a path he couldn't leave even when he started to see where it led. By 1975, when the FBI raided his house and arrested him in front of his 8-year-old daughter, Frank understood that option three came with costs he hadn't fully calculated that morning in 1969. But it was too late by then. The choice was made. The path was set. The empire was built and collapsed, and Frank Lucas was exactly who he'd chosen to be 6 years earlier. In prison, Frank had time to think about alternative realities. What if he'd chosen option one? He'd be running restaurants now. Maybe successful, maybe not legendary, but present, free, with his family. What if he'd chosen option two? His mother would have had that house with the garden. His siblings would have had opportunities. The Lucas family would have been lifted up, and Frank would have been the man who kept his promise in the most direct way possible. But Frank had chosen option three, and option three made him Frank Lucas, the legendary drug dealer, the man who cut out the Italian mafia, the man who built Blue Magic, the man who wore a chinchilla coat to the Ollie Frazier fight, the man who became a movie character. It also made him Frank Lucas, the prisoner, the informant, the man who betrayed everyone to reduce his sentence, the father who missed his daughter's childhood, the husband whose wife divorced him. The man who lived to 88 but spent decades wishing he'd chosen different. That's what that morning in March 1969 really decided. Not just what Frank would do with $100,000, but who Frank Lucas would become, and what that becoming would cost him. He chose empire, and empire chose everything else for him. Standing at his window that morning, circling option three on his Piece of paper, Frank Lucas felt powerful, certain, alive, like he was building exactly the life he was supposed to build. He couldn't see then that he was also building his own cage, that the empire that felt like freedom would become the thing that trapped him, that the power he was chasing would eventually chase him back and catch him. All he saw was $100,000, 3 options, and a choice that felt inevitable. He chose empire. And spent the rest of his life learning what empire costs, not just money, not just freedom, but alternatives, possibilities, the chance to be someone other than who you became. Frank Lucas died in 2019, having lived long enough to see every consequence of that choice, having had decades to think about those 3 options, having had time to imagine the parallel lives he didn't live. But in March 1969, sitting at his kitchen table at 11:32 a.m., circling option 3, Frank Lucas was 38 years old and certain he was choosing exactly right. And maybe he was, maybe that's who Frank Lucas was always going to be. Maybe options 1 and 2 were never really options for a man like him. Maybe the choice was already made before he wrote it down. Or maybe that's what Frank told himself later to make peace with it. To accept that he'd chosen power over everything else and that choice had defined his entire life. Either way, the choice was made, the money was reinvested, the empire was built, and Frank Lucas became exactly who he chose to become that morning, for better and worse, mostly worse, but undeniably, completely, irreversibly his choice.